My name is Beatrice Holloway, though I was born Beatrice Renford on a rain-soaked September morning in 1850, the 17th day, in a modest timber house near the moors of Derbyshire. That makes me 75 years now, as I speak these words into this curious recording device, my voice steady, though my hands tremble faintly against the table before me. I have borne a silent weight through all these passing years, a quiet resentment toward those who never saw my sister and me as two lives bound together by fate, but as something to be studied, separated in thought, if not in flesh. Eleanor and I were never truly apart, joined at the waist from the very beginning. We shared not only a body, but the same breath, the same warmth, and the same unyielding pulse of a single, defiant life. Doctors and preachers alike whispered of separation, of saving one by sacrificing the other. But I begged them, oh how I begged, to leave us as God had made us. That plea echoes in me still, unresolved, a thread of defiance woven through every year of my life. It was not fear of death that drove me, but the terror of being halved, of losing the only one who truly knew the shape of my world from within. Our family was of the land, simple folk who tilled the thin soil of the Cornish cliffs, where the sea roared like a constant companion, and the wind carried the salt of wrecks long swallowed. My father, Josiah Penberthy, was a fisherman by trade, though the pilchard shoals grew scarcer with each passing season, forcing him to mend nets and haul kelp under skies that seemed forever bruised. He was a man of few words, broad-shouldered from years pulling lines on trawlers out of Penzance, his face etched with lines from squinting into the fog. Mother, Beatrice, came from a line of 10 miners' daughters. She was the steady heart of our home, her hands calloused from carding wool and churning butter in the dim light of our single-room dwelling. We were not poor in the abject sense, no starving beggars on the roads to Bodmin, but neither were we blessed with abundance. The census takers in '51 marked us as laborers, our cottage a speck on the parish rolls amid the granite tors and smuggling coves. I remember the air thick with the scent of peat smoke and bacon pasties as Mother labored through that endless night. The midwife, old Mrs. Tremaine, had come from the village with her herbs and linens, but even she paled when we emerged. Leora and I were born together, fused side by side, our arms reaching out like mirrored branches from a shared trunk. The doctor from St. Ives arrived at dawn, his spectacles fogged from the climb, and declared us a medical marvel, though his voice held no wonder, only the cold calculation of a man accustomed to dissecting the misfortunes of others. Father stood by the door, his pipe unlit, staring as if we'd been delivered from some ancient tale of selkies or changelings. Mother, pale and spent on the straw mattress, reached for us both, her fingers tracing the seam where our skins met, just below the ribs. "My little doves," she whispered, though her eyes brimmed with the fear every mother knows when the world turns unkind. In those first weeks, life settled into a fragile rhythm. We nursed from Mother in tandem, our heads turning as one toward her warmth, our tiny fingers clasping in the space between. The cottage became a sanctuary of hushed tones. Neighbors brought pilchards and clotted cream, peeking through the shutters with mixtures of pity and morbid fascination. Father took to the sea earlier each day, returning with hauls that barely filled the creel, his silence growing heavier. By the time we were 3 months old, the whispers had spread beyond St. Ives. Tales of the Penberthy twins, the joined girls who moved as if puppeteered by invisible strings. A parson from Truro came calling, Bible in hand, speaking of divine tests and the perils of unnatural births. He suggested prayer vigils, but his eyes lingered too long on our form, wrapped in Mother's shawl. As we grew, the world narrowed to the rhythms of our shared existence. By age 2, we could sit upright together on the rush mat by the hearth, our legs splayed in unison, giggling at the flicker of flames, while Mother stirred the pottage of barley and leeks. Father fashioned a low bench from driftwood so we might be carried outside on fine days, where the gulls wheeled overhead and the heather bloomed purple against the cliffs. We learned to crawl as a single unit, our arms propelling us forward in awkward harmony, bumping against the legs of the oaken table or the stone walls damp with sea mist. Leora was the bolder spirit, her dark curls mirroring mine, but her gaze always seeking the horizon, while I, Elowen, preferred the quiet patterns of the woven baskets Mother plaited from rushes. Yet we were inseparable in thought as well. A glance, a tilt of the head, and we understood the other's mind without a word. It was as if our souls had bridged the flesh that bound us. The summers of the early 1850s brought a semblance of normalcy, or what passed for it in our corner of Cornwall. Father joined the pilchard drives in '53 when the boats returned heavy with silver-scaled bounty, and for a season we feasted on fresh fish grilled over peat fires. Mother taught us the names of the wildflowers, thrift and sea campion dotting the paths to the cove, her voice a soft lilt as she held us both in her lap. But illness shadowed us, as it did all families then. In the winter of 1854, a fever swept through the parish, claiming the baker's boy and old widow Kello. It spared us, though Mother weakened from the strain of carrying our weight, her steps slower as she hauled water from the well. The doctor returned that year, not with elixirs, but with pamphlets from London, speaking of Siamese twins he'd read of in the journals. Chang and Eng, they called them, joined like us, but living as men of means across the ocean. "There are ways," he said to Father one evening, his voice low by the fire. "Surgeries in Edinburgh or Paris that might free one of them." I was too young to grasp the words, but Leora stiffened against me, our shared pulse quickening. Father waved him off, muttering of costs we could never meet, but the seed was planted, a shadow over our days. By 5 years old in 1856, we had adapted to our form with the resilience of children. We walked with a rolling gait, supported by a cradle Father built from oak planks and leather straps, allowing us to navigate the cottage's confines. Outside, on the path to the village market, folks stared, manners in their oilskins, women with baskets of eggs, but Mother shielded us with her apron, bartering for flour and salt without a flinch. We played with corn-husk dolls she made, inventing tales of mermaids who swam free in the cove, though Leora often grew restless, her eyes on the boats bobbing in the harbor. "One day," she would murmur to me, our foreheads touching, "we'll see the world beyond these cliffs." I believed her, for in our unity the world felt vast enough, yet the parson's visits persisted, his sermons now laced with talk of providence and correction, hinting that our joining was a trial to be endured or, perhaps, resolved. Mother prayed in the corner by the crucifix, her rosary beads clicking like distant waves, while Father drowned his doubts in cider at the alehouse. Little did we know, the pressures mounting would soon test the very bond that defined us. The year 1857 brought changes that crept in like the morning mist rolling off the Atlantic, subtle at first, but heavy with foreboding. Father had taken on extra work mending the hulls of fishing boats in St. Ives Harbor, his hands blackened with tar and pitch, coming home late with the smell of brine clinging to his woolen coat. The pilchard season had been meager again, and whispers of enclosure acts reached even our remote cottage. Landlords fencing off common grazing for sheep that fetched better prices in Plymouth markets. Mother fretted over the rising cost of meal, her fingers working faster at the spinning wheel to weave kerchiefs she could sell to the fishwives. Leora and I, at 6 years old, sensed the strain in the silences that stretched longer around the supper table, where our shared plate of potatoes and herring grew smaller portions. We had grown accustomed to our movements by then, a synchronized dance born of necessity. To stand, we leaned into each other, our hips aligned like the keels of Father's skiff, propelling us forward in a swaying rhythm that covered the ground slower than other children, but with a determination all our own. Mother fashioned a harness from old sailcloth, padded with sheep's wool, so that on market days she could carry us both on her back like a pair of saddlebags, though it left her shoulders rubbed raw. In the cottage, we helped as we could, Leora sorting the peas from their pods with her left hand while I managed the right, our voices blending in simple songs Mother taught us, old Cornish ballads of lost lovers in stormy seas. Trelawney, we sang, our tones harmonizing without effort, as if our joined form amplified the melody. But the village was no longer content with glances from afar. By spring, a group of men from the parish council arrived unannounced, led by Squire Hargreaves, whose estate sprawled over the headlands above our cove. He was a tall figure in his frock coat, with a watch chain glinting like fool's gold, and his wife trailed behind, her lace collar starched against the damp air. They had heard the tales, they said, and come to see for themselves this affliction that burdened the community. Father met them at the door, his cap in hand, while Mother drew us close on the bench by the fire. The squire peered at us as one might inspect a lame horse at market, his voice measured as he spoke of charity and spectacle. "The good Lord provides trials," he intoned, "but also remedies. There are physicians in London who might alleviate this." Leora squeezed my hand beneath the folds of our shared skirt, her palm damp, and I felt the flutter of her breath against my side. Word spread faster than the gorse fires that autumn, drawing more visitors, travelers from as far as Exeter, clutching broadsheets with woodcuts of malformed beasts and wonders of nature. One afternoon in July, a showman named Mr. Elias Crow rolled into St. Ives with his painted wagon, banners proclaiming "Freaks of the Realm." He sought permission from Father to exhibit us, offering a sovereign for each performance, enough to pay the rent for a year. Father refused, his jaw set like the granite cliffs, but the temptation lingered in his eyes as he tallied the empty hooks on his line that night. Mother wept quietly after they left, her tears soaking the hem of my sleeve as she rocked us both. "You're my blessings, not my burdens," she murmured, but doubt had entered our home like damp through the thatch. Schooling was another matter, denied us by circumstance and cruelty. The dame school in the village chapel took children from age 5, but the head mistress, Mrs. Paul Whale, sent word that our form would disturb the others. Instead, Mother taught us letters by scratching them into the sand with a stick, her voice patient as she spelled out Bible verses. "What God hath joined, let no man put asunder." We traced the shapes with our fingers, Leora's bolder strokes curving the O's wide, while mine steadied the lines. On Sundays, we attended chapel in a corner pew, veiled by Mother's shawl, though the congregation's murmurs rose like the tide, prayers for our deliverance, glances that pinned us like specimens under glass. The parson, Reverend Ellis, preached more fervently now, citing passages from Leviticus on blemishes and purity, his sermons twisting our existence into a parable of sin or redemption. Winter, 1858 tested us further. A storm battered the coast in January, waves crashing high enough to salt the fields, and Father's boat was stove in against the rocks at Godrevy. He washed ashore half drowned, ribs cracked, and took to his bed for weeks, coughing up seawater in the night. With no harvest from the sea, we lived on Mother's weaving and the scant charity of neighbors, loaves from the baker, a jug of milk from Widow Jenkin. Leora and I lay awake those cold evenings, our shared warmth a small comfort against the drafts whistling through the shutters. She whispered dreams of escape, of sailing to America where Chang and Eng had made their fortune, exhibited but free in their way. We could be like them, she said, her voice fierce, not hidden, but seen on our terms. I nodded, though fear coiled in my chest. The thought of stages and crowds terrified me more than the isolation. By summer's end, the pressures converged. The squire returned with a proposal, fund a journey to a surgeon in Bristol, where advances in anatomy promised separation. The cost, he claimed, could be offset by donations from the curious, turning our trial into a cause. Father wavered, consulting the parson, who nodded gravely and spoke of mercy for the soul that might thrive alone. Mother opposed it fiercely, barricading the door when the doctor from Truro arrived, with diagrams of incisions and ether. Leora and I, 7 now, listened from the loft, our hearts pounding in unison. "They'll tear us apart," she breathed, and I clung to her, the first seeds of my plea forming in the dark. The argument raged below, Father's desperation clashing with Mother's faith, until a compromise emerged. We would go, but only to consult, not to cut. As the carriage was hired for the road to Bristol in September 1858, I felt the world's hands closing in, pulling at the threads of our unity. Little did I know how that journey would forge the resolve that would define the years to come. The carriage jolted over the rutted roads from St. Ives, each bump sending a tremor through our joined frame as if the earth itself conspired against our wholeness. It was September 1858, and I was 7, Leora the same, our small world expanding unwillingly beyond the familiar cliffs into the sprawl of England proper. Father sat opposite, his face gaunt from the summer's hardships, clutching a worn leather satchel with the few shillings scraped from neighbors' pity. Mother rode beside him, her arm around our shoulders, her grip firm as the harness that bound us to the worn cushions. The vehicle was a hired post-chaise from the inn at Hayley, its springs creaking under the weight of 4 souls, carrying burdens far heavier than flesh. We traveled by day to avoid the chill, stopping at coaching inns where the ostlers gawked openly, their whispers following us like shadows. The Cornish twins fused like barnacles on a hull. The journey stretched over 3 long days, the landscape shifting from the rugged moors of Cornwall to the gentler hills of Devon, then the bustling lanes leading to Bristol. Leora and I passed the hours in quiet observation, our heads resting together against the window glass smeared with road dust. We watched hedgerows blur into fields of ripening wheat, harvest men with scythes, pausing to stare as the carriage rattled past. Mother murmured prayers under her breath, her rosary beads clicking softly, while Father spoke little, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if seeking some sign from the God who had shaped us so. At night, in cramped rooms above the tap rooms, we shared a narrow bed, our bodies aligned as always, the candlelight flickering on the walls papered with faded florals. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of knives and severed threads, though we dared not voice them aloud. Bristol met us with a clamor that drowned the sea's roar we'd known all our lives. The city sprawled like a living beast, its streets choked with coal smoke from the manufactories along the Avon, where barges laden with iron and cloth nudged against the quays. We arrived at dusk on the third day, the air thick with the tang of tar and river mud, and took lodgings at a modest inn near the harbor, the Blue Anchor, its sign swinging in the wind off the water. Father had arranged it all through the squire's letter, and the landlord, a stout man named Mr. Hargrove, showed us to a corner room with a single wide bed and a table scarred from years of tankards. "For the young lady's comfort," he said, his eyes lingering on our form before he bustled away. That first evening, Mother bathed us in a tin hip bath filled from the pump, her hands gentle as she soaped our shared skin, singing a lullaby of the tin mines to ease our fears. But Leora turned restless, her fingers tracing the seam at our side. "What if they try?" she whispered when the others slept. I pressed my cheek to hers, our breaths mingling. "They won't," I replied, though my voice wavered like the inn's lantern in the draught. The consultation was set for the morrow at the Bristol Infirmary, a grand edifice of brick and stone rising amid the city's fog, its doors guarded by iron railings and the stern gaze of porters in livery. Father hired a gig to carry us there, the horses' hooves clopping on cobblestones slick with morning rain. The waiting room was a chamber of polished oak and gas lamps, filled with the low hum of patients, limbs in splints, coughs echoing off the walls. We sat on a bench too narrow for our width, Leora and I holding hands in the space between, while Mother smoothed our frock, a simple gray woolen thing she'd mended a dozen times. Father paced, his boots scuffing the floorboards, until a nurse in starched cap summoned us to the surgeon's office. Dr. Alistair Beaumont was a man of middle years, his hair silvered at the temples, spectacles perched on a nose sharp as a quill. He rose from behind a desk cluttered with leather-bound volumes and sketches of the human form, diagrams of torsos marked with lines and arrows, like maps to buried treasure. "The Penberthy twins," he said, his voice crisp as autumn frost, gesturing us to a low couch upholstered in green velvet. Mother helped us onto it, our legs dangling as one, and the doctor circled us slowly, his fingers probing the joint at our ribs with clinical detachment, as if we were a specimen from the Royal Society's cabinets. Leora tensed, her hand squeezing mine until the knuckles whitened, and I felt the rapid thrum of our shared pulse, like a bird trapped in a cage. He spoke at length, his words measured, drawing parallels to cases he'd studied, the Siamese twins in their American exhibitions, a pair separated in Vienna with one surviving the ether. "Your connection is symmetrical," he explained, tapping a diagram with his pen. "Torso to torso, likely sharing vascular and perhaps neural pathways. Separation is feasible, though not without risk. One might walk free, live a normal life, while the other," he trailed off, his eyes meeting Father's, "the weaker vessel may not endure." Mother gasped, crossing herself, but Father leaned forward, his voice rough from disuse. "And the cost, Doctor? Could the parish fund it?" Beaumont nodded, outlining a procedure under chloroform, incisions along the seam, weeks of recovery in the infirmary wards. He painted a picture of liberation, one girl to marry, to bear children, to claim the life denied by their bond, while the other might find solace in a convent or gentle care. Leora could bear it no longer. "No!" she cried, her voice piercing the room's hush, our bodies shifting as one against the couch. "You cannot cut us apart. We're not two halves to be mended like a torn sail." The doctor paused, his brow furrowing, and I found my own words tumbling out, fueled by the terror coiling in our chest. "Please, sir, we've begged Mother and Father. Leave us as we are. To separate would kill us both, not save one. God made us this way for a reason, and no knife of man should undo it. Tears welled in my eyes, spilling hot down our cheeks, and Mother knelt beside us, her arms encircling our waist. Father stood silent, his face a mask of conflict, while Beaumont adjusted his spectacles unmoved. "It is a compassionate choice," he replied gently, "but one for your guardians to weigh. Think of the years ahead, marriage, independence, the world's opportunities. We left that office unchanged in body, but scarred in spirit. The gig carrying us back through Bristol's throng amid the clamor of street vendors hawking hot chestnuts and broadsheets. The consultation had planted deeper roots of doubt. Father spoke of it that night over a supper of bread and cheese, his voice laced with the ale from the tap room. One of you could be free, he said, looking at us with eyes hollowed by want. Mother shook her head, her lips pressed thin, but the seed of separation had taken hold, whispering of futures divided. As autumn deepened, with leaves turning gold along the Avon before our return to Cornwall, Leora and I clung to each other in the inn's bed, our pleas echoing unspoken in the dark. The journey home would be heavier, laden with the knowledge that the world's mercy sought to unravel what fate had woven, and our defiance was only beginning to harden against it. The road back to Cornwall unspooled like a frayed rope, pulling us westward through the sodden fields of Somerset and the wilds of Exmoor, where the carriage wheels sank into mud churned by autumn rains. It was late September, 1858, and the air grew sharper with each mile, carrying the faint brine that heralded home. Leora and I rode in silence much of the way, our joined hands clasped beneath the traveling rug Mother had tucked around us, her own face drawn as she stared out at the passing hedgerows heavy with blackberries. Father dozed fitfully, his snores ragged from the inn's poor ale, but when awake, he spoke in fragments of the doctor's words, freedom for one, a chance at normalcy, his voice testing the waters of temptation. "Think on it," he murmured once, as the sun dipped low over the tors, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror our divided fates. Mother hushed him, her fingers twisting the rosary at her waist, but the rift had widened, a silent current running beneath our shared existence. We arrived at the cottage under a sky-bruised purple, the familiar outline of St. Ives Harbor glinting like shattered glass in the twilight. The neighbors gathered at the gate, their faces etched with curiosity and concern. Mrs. Jenkin with a pot of stew still warm from her hearth, the baker's wife clutching a loaf wrapped in cloth. They pressed for news of the city surgeon, their questions tumbling like pebbles down the cliff path. Had we seen the wonders of Bristol? Would the knife bring relief? Father waved them off wearily, carrying us inside on the oak cradle while Mother unpacked the satchel, her movements precise but her eyes distant. That night, as the peat fire crackled and filled the room with its earthy smoke, Leora turned to me in the dim light of our truckle bed. "They'll try again," she whispered, her breath warm against my ear. "But we'll fight it, Elowen, together." I nodded, feeling the steady rhythm of our heart, a quiet vow forming in the space between us. The winter that followed was one of the harshest in memory, winds howling off the Atlantic like mourners at a wake, piling snow against the cottage walls until the door could scarcely open. Father mended his boat through the long days, hammering copper sheathing in the shed by the cove, his hammer strikes echoing our own unresolved tensions. The squire's promise of parish funds lingered like a half-remembered dream. Letters arrived from Bristol with diagrams and estimates, each one fueling debates that stretched into the evenings. Mother burned the last in the fire one February night, her face set like flint. "No man plays God in my house," she declared, and for a time the matter rested, buried under the weight of survival. We turned 8 that March, our birthday marked with a pasty filled with scavenged mutton scraps and a currant cake Mother baked in the black oven outside. Leora blew out the single candle for us both, her wish unspoken but clear in the squeeze of her fingers, wholeness unbroken. Yet the village's gaze had sharpened since our absence, the whispers evolving into bolder intrusions. By spring 1859, as the pilchard boats dotted the bay once more, a committee formed under Reverend Ellis's guidance, a blend of parish elders and the squire's tenants, pooling coppers for what they called our Deliverance Fund. They visited weekly, bearing tracts on medical miracles and testimonies from separated twins in far-off places, their eyes gleaming with the zeal of reformers. One afternoon in May, as we sat on the bench weaving rushes into mats under Mother's watchful eye, Squire Hargreaves arrived with a physician from Penzance, a younger man named Dr. Trevithick, whose family had roots in the mining valleys. He examined us in the cottage's confines, his stethoscope cold against our shared chest, listening to the dual lungs drawing breath as one. "Remarkable symmetry," he noted, sketching our form on foolscap with quick strokes. "With proper care, separation could yield 2 viable lives. The risk to both is high, but to leave you so, it denies you the fullness of God's design." Leora bristled, our shoulders rising in unison. "Our design is His, Doctor, not yours to redraw." I echoed her, my voice steadier than I felt, pleading as the words had taken root during the journey home. "We've seen your drawings, heard your promises of freedom, but what of the cost? One of us might walk alone, yes, but halved in soul, adrift without the other. We've begged you, Father, Mother, the parson, all to let us be. To cut would unravel not just flesh, but the very thread that makes us whole." The men exchanged glances, Trevithick folding his notes with a sigh, while the squire patted Father's shoulder, murmuring of subscriptions from Exeter gentry. Mother stood by the door, arms crossed, her silence a wall against their tide. The fund grew slowly, a few shillings from market stalls and chapel plates, enough by summer's end to cover a second consultation, this time in Plymouth, where naval surgeons boasted of ether triumphs from the Crimean fields. Father relented under the weight of it all. The empty nets, the rising rent from the squire's agent, the fear that our form doomed us to beggary or worse. "Just to see," he said, echoing the Bristol Compromise, though his eyes avoided ours. The journey east was swifter this time, by coastal steamer from St. Ives, the deck pitching under Atlantic swells that matched the churn in our stomachs. Plymouth was a hive of activity, its docks thronged with sailors in blue jackets and merchants haggling over wool bales, the air sharp with pitch pine from the shipyards. We lodged at the Union Inn, its rooms echoing with the shouts from the Hoe, where cannon salutes marked the Queen's distant health. The surgeon there, Captain Elias Hawthorne, was a veteran of Balaclava, his office lined with sabers and bottled specimens from the war, limbs preserved in spirits, maps of battle wounds. He was brisk, his examination thorough, pressing instruments along our join to test nerves and sinews. "The bond is vascular, not vital to the core," he concluded, rolling down his sleeves. "One could survive independently, perhaps both with skill, but the choice is yours, or rather your guardian's. Imagine, schooling, suitors, lives unbound." Leora laughed bitterly, a sound that startled even me. "Suitors? For what? A half-life piece from another's ruin." I joined her plea. Ears pricking as I described the nights we'd lain awake, feeling each other's fears as our own. Separation isn't mercy, it's murder of the spirit. We've begged since the first whisper of it. Leave us, I implore you. We're stronger entwined than any free soul alone. Hawthorne paused, his military bearing softening a fraction. Many have pleaded against the blade, only to thank it later. But father, swayed by tales of soldiers mended from worse, agreed to consider. Mother pulled us from the room, her face ashen, and on the steamer home, with gulls wheeling overhead and the spray mist in our faces, we vowed silently to resist. The pressures mounted like the summer fog, cloaking our days in uncertainty. Yet in that shared resolve, we found a quiet strength. Little did we know, the true test of our unity lay ahead, as the world beyond Cornwall began to beckon with promises more seductive than any surgeon's knife. As the autumn of 1859 deepened, turning the gorse to gold along the cliff paths, a new shadow fell over our cottage, one born not of scalpels and sermons, but of spectacle and silver. The whispers from Plymouth had not stayed confined to the steamer's decks. They drifted back to Saint. Dives on the tongues of fishermen who had kin in the naval yards, tales of the joined girls examined by the war surgeon, their pleas against the knife twisted into rumors of reluctance overcome by reason. Reverend Ellis preached a sermon that October, his voice rising above the chapel's damp stone arches, calling our case a beacon for faith and fortitude, urging the congregation to bolster the fund not just for surgery, but for whatever path Providence might illuminate. The plates passed heavier that Sunday, clinking with coins from miners' wages and fishwives' savings, and by November the sum reached 20 pounds, enough, the squire declared, to draw eyes from afar. Father came home one evening with a broadsheet clutched in his tar-stained hands, its ink still fresh from the Plymouth printer. It bore a crude etching of two figures fused at the side, skirts billowing like sails, captioned, "The Enigma of Cornwall. Twins defy the blade." He spread it on the table by the oil lamp, his face flushed from the chill wind off the harbor. "They mean to help," he said, though his eyes betrayed the calculations of a man who saw in it a way out of the debtor's noose tightening around our tenancy. Mother snatched the paper, crumpling it into the fire without a word, but the damage was done. By week's end, a letter arrived from London, penned by a promoter named Mr. Reginald Voss, agent for the Egyptian Hall exhibitions. He proposed a tour, not as freaks, he assured, but as living testaments to nature's wonders, with fees that could fund any medical choice we made. Father read it aloud twice, the promise of 50 guineas per fortnight hanging in the air like the scent of fresh-baked saffron cake. Leora and I, 9 now, felt the shift as keenly as the turning tide. We had taken to spending our days in the small garden behind the cottage, where Mother planted potatoes in the thin soil, our hands working the earth in tandem, hers turning clods while mine sowed the seed. But that winter, as the first frosts rimed the hedgerows, Father called a family council by the hearth, the flames casting flickering shadows on the whitewashed walls. "No more hiding," he said, his voice rough as the grindstone he sharpened his hooks on. "The world knows of you now. Voss swears protection. No prodding, no separations forced. Just show yourselves. Earn enough to choose our fate." Mother wept then, her shoulders shaken as she knelt before us, but Leora met his gaze steadily. "And if they push the knife once we're away? We've begged you all, village, doctors, parson, to leave us be. This tour, it could bind us tighter to their whims." I nodded, my words softer but no less firm. "Father, Think of the crowds. Their stares would peel us like onions, layer by layer, until nothing remains but what they demand. Yet desperation won the day, as it often did in those lean years. The Enclosure Acts had fenced off more common land by 1860, squeezing Father's fishing yields as sheep grazed where pilchards once fed the seas. With the rent due and the agent's threats echoing, we agreed to a trial. 3 months in the West Country halls, under Voss's watchful eye. No mention of surgery in the contracts. Mother packed our trunk with care, folding the gray frocks and the woolen shawls, her fingers lingering on the seams as if mending invisible wounds. We departed in March, the coastal road winding past Land's End under skies heavy with spring rain. The hired van jolting over granite-strewn lanes. Leora pressed against the window, her dark eyes tracing the whitecaps far below, while I felt the familiar sway of our form against the cushions, a rhythm that had carried us from cradle to this uncertain horizon. Our first engagement was in Falmouth, at a modest assembly room above the market square, its walls papered in faded crimson and lit by sputtering gas jets. Voss, a wiry man in a pinstriped waistcoat, greeted us with a flourish, his smile sharp as a gull's beak. He had built a platform of polished boards, draped in velvet the color of midnight, with chairs arranged in semicircles for the paying gentry, merchants from the packet ships, officers from the custom house, their wives in bombazine gowns whispering behind fans. Father stood at the wings, his cap twisted in his hands, while Mother sat in the front row, her face a mask of resolve. When the curtain parted, the room hushed, a sea of eyes fixing on us as we entered on the cradle Father wheeled, our skirts brushing the floor like whispers. Voss introduced us with practiced eloquence. Behold, Elowyn and Lyra Penberthy, the united sisters of Cornwall, born of the same breath, defying the divisions of man. We sat center stage, our hands folded in our laps, and spoke as rehearsed, simple tales of our home by the sea, the songs Mother taught, the dreams we shared without words. The audience leaned forward, some with notebooks sketching our form, others murmuring of biblical twins or the Siamese abroad. Questions followed, polite at first. How do you sleep? Does one feel the other's pain? Leora answered boldly, describing our synchronized steps along the cliff paths, while I added details of the wildflowers we gathered, thrift blooming red against the gray. But beneath the civility lurked the undercurrent we'd feared, a naval surgeon in the third row rising to inquire of separation, his voice laced with the authority of the Plymouth halls. Have you considered the ether? One might yet claim a separate destiny. I felt Leora's grip tighten, our pulse quickening like a storm building offshore. Sir, I replied, my voice carrying clear over the hush, we have considered it deeply, and begged all who propose it to reconsider. To sever us would dim the light we share, leaving shadows where wholeness once stood. We've pleaded with doctors and kin alike, leave us as we are, for in our unity lies our strength, not our sorrow. Applause rippled, mixed with murmurs, and Voss steered the evening to safer waters, but the seed was sown anew. That night, in our lodging above a chandler's shop, with the harbor bells tolling midnight, Leora turned to me in the wide bed. They see us as puzzles to solve, not souls to know. I agreed, the weight of the stage light still warming our skin, yet in the quiet we found a fragile peace, our pleas voiced to strangers, echoing farther than the cottage walls. The tour stretched into summer, moving from Falmouth to Truro Cathedral Close, then Exeter's Guildhall, each hall grander than the last, the crowd swelling with travelers from Bath and even London. Voss managed the finances shrewdly, paying Father weekly in crisp notes that eased the debts back home, though Mother watched every transaction like a hawk over her chicks. We adapted to the rhythm of it, the creak of stages, the scent of beeswax polish and audience perfumes, the way our words wove stories to hold their gaze without bearing our fears. Leora grew bolder in her recitals, reciting Cornish lore of ancient saints and shipwrecks, her voice drawing smiles from the skeptics. I complimented with quieter reflections on the feel of sea wind on our shared face, or the harmony of our laughter blending like waves on shingle. Yet the questions persisted, evolving from medical curiosities to moral quandaries. What of marriage, children, the weight of unlived lives? By August, as we reached Taunton amid the cider orchards heavy with fruit, exhaustion crept in. Our form ached from the constant motion, the cradle's wheels grinding on uneven floors, and the nights brought fevers from the close air of crowded inns. Father wrote to the squire of our earnings, hinting at enough for Bristol if we chose, but Mother burned the replies unread. One evening after a performance, as the audience filed out clutching programs with our likeness printed bold, a woman approached, Lady Eleanor Fitzroy, wife to a Devon baronet, her gown silk that rustled like leaves. She pressed a velvet pouch into Mother's hand, heavy with sovereigns, and knelt before us. "Your courage humbles me," she said softly. "Resist the blade. There is grace in your bond." Her words lingered as we traveled on, a rare balm against the tide. But as the leaves began to turn once more, Voss spoke of London lights and greater halls, the pull of the capital threatening to draw us deeper into the world's unyielding grasp. Our pleas had bought time, but the resolve to remain whole hardened with every mile. A quiet fire kindled in the heart we shared. The pull toward London proved irresistible, like the undertow dragging the swimmer beyond the breakers, and by October 1860 we found ourselves ensnared in the capital's relentless pulse. Voss had secured a season at the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly, a cavernous space of marble pillars and tiered galleries where gaslights hissed like serpents in the gloom. The journey north had been a blur of rattling trains from Exeter, the iron rails humming beneath us as we crossed the Thames at dusk, its waters black as ink under the bridges. Leora and I, 10 years old now, pressed our faces to the carriage window, watching the spires of Westminster pierce the fog, a world so vast it dwarfed the cliffs of home. Father walked taller in his new wool coat, bought with tour earnings, while Mother clutched her reticule, her eyes scanning the throngs of top-hatted gentlemen and crinolined ladies as if seeking escape routes in the crowd. Our lodgings were above a tobacconist's in Covent Garden, the air thick with the scent of pipe shag and overripe fruit from the market stalls below. The room was narrow, with a single sash window overlooking the piazza where actors hawked playbills and flower girls called their wares till midnight. Voss installed us there with a nurse of his hiring, Mrs. Agnes Poole, a stout widow from Lambeth, whose hands were gentle but her gaze appraising, as if measuring our novelty against her wages. She helped with our ablutions in the hip bath, her touch efficient as she sponged our shared form, murmuring of the cholera scares that had swept the slums 2 summers past. "Mind the damp," she advised. "London's vapors play havoc with the lungs." Father ventured out daily to the hall, negotiating with promoters, while Mother ventured little farther than the chandler's for bread and cheese, her Cornish lilt drawing stares from the costermongers. The performances at the Egyptian Hall were a far cry from the provincial assembly rooms, audiences numbered in the hundreds, filling from silk-upholstered boxes to benches crammed with clerks and curiosity seekers. Voss had refined our act into a tableau vivant, positioning us on a dais swathed in crimson damask, with a backdrop painted to mimic Cornish seascapes, waves crashing against granite, gulls frozen mid-flight. We entered to a hush broken only by the rustle of programs, our cradle wheeled by attendants in livery, and recited verses from Tennyson's latest In Memoriam, our voices blending in solemn cadence to evoke themes of unity and loss. The crowd responded with restrained applause, though afterward, in the green room scented with cold cream and laudanum, they pressed forward with questions veiled as compliments. How did we manage modesty in dress? Did our minds ever quarrel within one form? Leora fielded the bolder inquiries, her wit sharpened by the city's edge, while I spoke of simpler joys, the taste of mother's pasties, or the rhythm of waves lulling us to sleep. Yet beneath the veneer of refinement lurked the familiar undercurrents. Physicians from the Royal College attended incognito, their notebooks concealed in opera cloaks, probing with queries on our physiology, the mechanics of our digestion, the symmetry of our limbs. One evening in November, as fog cloaked the streets and muffled the cries of link boys, a delegate from the Royal Society approached post-curtain, a Dr. Silas Wentworth, his beard trimmed precise as a surgeon's blade. He requested a private audience in the hall's antechamber, where gas jets flickered on walls hung with faded engravings of anatomical wonders. Father assented, hoping for patronage, and Mother shadowed us like a sentinel. Wentworth examined us under the lamplight, his fingers tracing the join with a feather-light touch that belied his intent. The vascular linkage is intricate, but not insuperable, he concluded, sketching on vellum with a silver pencil. Advances in ligation, tying off the shared vessels, could permit division with minimal loss. One twin might pursue education, even marriage, while the other receives custodial care. Have you not considered it? Your pleas against separation, voiced so eloquently on stage, move the heart, but reason urges the blade. Leora's eyes flashed, our shoulders squaring as one. Reason, sir? We've weighed it heavier than any scale in your laboratories. From Bristol to Plymouth we've begged, doctors, kin, villagers, to honor the form God granted. To sever us is to orphan the soul that thrives in tandem. Imagine not just the flesh parted, but the silence where understanding once flowed without words. We've pleaded for wholeness, not halves bartered for normalcy. Wentworth inclined his head, unmoved, and pressed a card into Father's palm, promising introductions to Harley Street specialists. That night, back in Covent Garden, as the market's din faded to snores and distant carriage wheels, Leora whispered fiercely in the four-poster bed, its hangings drawn against the chill. They see profit in our parting, Elowen. Specimens for their journals, one to parade as success. I held her hand, feeling the warmth radiate through our side, our shared breath steadying the fear. We'll hold fast, I replied, as the cliffs withstand the gale. The season wore on through the damp winter of 1860 to 61, the Thames freezing in patches while newsboys hawked broadsheets of Garibaldi's unification in Italy, a distant echo of our own entwined state. Earnings flowed steadily, Voss paid in gold sovereigns that clinked like promises in Father's purse, enough to send remittances to the squire, easing the tenancy back home. But isolation gnawed at us. Schooled only in stolen hours with Mrs. Poole's primers, we traced maps of the empire on the lodgings table, dreaming of places beyond the smog, the Spice Islands, the American prairies where Chang and Eng had claimed their independence. Leora yearned for it openly, her stories on stage weaving tales of explorers unbound, while I found solace in the British Museum's reading room, wheeled there by Father on quiet afternoons, our eyes devouring volumes on natural history without the prodding of examiners. By spring 1861, as cherry blossoms dusted the parks despite the coal haze, exhaustion compounded with homesickness. Our form tired from the nightly exertions, joints aching like fathers after a long haul, and fevers came more frequently, quelled by Mrs. Poole's herbal draughts. Voss proposed extending to the provinces again, but father, buoyed by a letter from Truro praising our elevated contributions, suggested a pause. Mother seized the moment, insisting on a return to Cornwall for the pilchard season, where the sea air might restore us. The journey south was a balm, the train's rhythm lulling us through green counties, but upon arrival the cottage felt altered. Neighbors' greetings laced with envy over our London polish, the squire inquiring after the fund, now swelled by our fame. Reverend Ellis visited soon after, his Bible open to Corinthians on the body as temple, urging that our exhibitions proved God's design for witness, not severance. Yet in private, father confessed doubts, the sovereign's burning a hole in his resolve. That summer, as we sat by the cove watching boats drift on the tide, Leora turned to me, our skirts damp from the spray. The world has shown us its face, kind and cruel in equal measure, but our pleas have carried us this far, unbroken. I agreed, the sun warming our shared skin, though a quiet foreboding lingered, as if the currents beneath were shifting toward deeper waters. The tour had forged us, not fractured, but the whispers of separation echoed still, waiting for the next storm to stir them. The years following our return from London settled into a deceptive calm, like the sea glassing over before a squall, with the cottage reclaiming us amid the familiar cadence of tides and tasks. It was summer 1861, and at 10, Leora and I had outgrown the oak cradle father once wheeled us in. Our steps now a deliberate sway across the flagstones, supported by a pair of canes mother carved from yew branches felled in the squire's wood. The tour's earnings had paid the rent arrears and stocked the larder with salted pilchards and barrels of cider, but they also drew the village closer, their admiration laced with expectation. Neighbors who once averted their eyes now sought stories of the great city, the gas-lit halls, the throngs in their finery, and we obliged in quiet evenings by the hearth, our voices weaving the tale as mother mended nets, her needle flashing in the lamplight. Father, emboldened by the sovereigns that had lightened his burdens, took to the boats with renewed vigor that pilchard season, his lines yielding fuller hauls under skies cleared by westerly winds. He spoke less of separation now, the memory of London's physicians fading like the fog off Godrevy, though letters from Voss arrived sporadically, proposing autumn engagements in Bath or Bristol, where the waters drew the afflicted and the curious alike. Mother intercepted most, feeding them to the fire with a murmur of thanks for the respite. But one evening in September, as the harvest moon rose full over the cliffs, father laid one on the table unopened. "We've a choice now," he said, his pipe smoke curling toward the rafters. "The fund stands at near £50 from the exhibitions, enough for schooling perhaps, or a home of our own away from prying eyes." Leora and I exchanged a glance, our hands meeting in the space between our skirts. "Schooling for what, father?" she asked, her tone even. "To learn the arts of parting? We've begged you since the cradle. Let the money build something whole, not rend us asunder." The debate simmered through the autumn as leaves turned russet on the sycamores lining the path to St. Ives Market. Reverend Ellis mediated one Sunday after chapel, his study warm with the scent of beeswax candles and drying herbs, the walls lined with volumes from Oxford presses. He quoted Paul on the body as one, yet nodded to the squire's view that Providence had granted us visibility for a purpose, to inspire charity, perhaps, or fund a remedy that might yet reveal God's fuller design. Mother countered with verses from Genesis on creation's intent, her voice steady as the chapel bell. Leora and I sat silent at first, our canes leaning against the desk, but when the parson turned to us with gentle inquiry, "Do your hearts not yearn for separate paths?" I found the words rising unbidden. "Reverend, our hearts beat as one. To yearn for division would be to deny the pulse that sustains us. From the surgeon's tables to the stage lights, we've pleaded, honor this unity, for in it lies not affliction, but a grace beyond your understanding. Separation promises freedom to one, but chains the soul that remains, echoing with absence." His brow furrowed, but he offered no rebuke, and the matter rested uneasily as winter closed in. We turned 11 that March 1862, the birthday marked with a pilgrimage to the cove at low tide, where we gathered shells in the rock pools, periwinkles and limpets, their iridescent hues mirroring the seam at our side. Mother baked a cake heavy with raisins scavenged from the previous year's stores, and Father brought a string of mackerel fresh from the trawl, grilled over driftwood until the fat sizzled and popped. The village seemed to accept our form more readily then, children trailing us on market days with shy questions about London, though the elders still whispered of the fund, now invested in parish bonds yielding meager interest. Schooling remained a private affair. Mother hired a tutor from Penzance, Miss Clara Nancaro, a spinster daughter of a mine captain, who came thrice weekly to teach us arithmetic and history from dog-eared primers. She arrived on foot over the moors, her satchel bulging with slates and maps, and settled us at the table with quills dipped in ink from walnut husks. Miss Nancaro proved a quiet ally, her lessons unfolding without pity or probe. We learned of the empire's reach, the opium wars concluded, the cotton famine gnawing at Lancashire mills from the American strife, and traced our fingers over illustrations of conjoined figures in ancient lore, from Hindu deities to medieval illuminations. Leora excelled in geography, her mind mapping routes to distant shores where twins like us might find kinships unspoken, while I favored literature, reciting passages from Wordsworth on nature's bonds, our voices harmonizing the lines as if the poet had foreseen our shared breath. Yet even in those hours, the shadow lingered. One afternoon in May, as rain pattered on the thatch, Miss Nancaro broached the subject gently. "The world advances in medicine," she said, adjusting her spectacles. "Have you truly weighed the surgeon's arts?" Leora stiffened, our quills pausing mid-stroke. "We've weighed them heavier than any balance, ma'am. From Bristol's cold couches to London's learned halls, our pleas have been constant. Spare us the knife, for it severs more than flesh, the very essence that makes us endure." She nodded, turning the page to Roman history instead, and the lesson resumed, but the intrusion marked a turning. By summer, Voss's persistence bore fruit. A contract arrived for a modest tour of the West Country spas, framed as lectures on natural philosophy to attract the genteel invalid class seeking Bath's curative springs. Father signed it in the squire's parlor, the ink drying under crystal decanters, promising earnings to expand the cottage with a proper chamber for us. Mother relented only when Voss swore no medical demonstrations, and we departed in August, the van laden with our trunk and the U-canes, the roads winding through Devon's combs, where apple orchards bowed under their fruit. Bath welcomed us with its honeyed stone and pump rooms redolent of mineral waters, our engagements in the assembly's side chambers, where patrons in wheeled chairs gathered to hear tales of Cornish resilience. The audiences there were kinder, their questions rooted in sympathy rather than scrutiny. How did we navigate the bath chair's confines? Did the waters ease our joined aches? And we answered with candor, describing the steam rising from the Roman baths like ghosts of antiquity, our pleas against separation, woven naturally into reflections on wholeness. Leora spoke of the shared dreams that bridged our minds, vivid as the Avon's flow, while I evoked the quiet strength of cliffs unmoved by storms. Earnings flowed again, sovereigns clinking in mother's reticule, but fatigue shadowed us. The constant sway of travel strained our frame, nights bringing cramps that twisted like ropes in our core. By October, as we returned home amid falling leaves, a fever took hold, not the cholera that stalked the ports, but a low ague from the damp roads, confining us to bed for weeks with poultices of mustard and willow bark. Mother nursed us through it, her hands cool on our brow, while Father paced the floorboards, guilt etching deeper lines on his face. The illness passed by November, leaving us wearier but resolute, our pleas now a refrain etched in the family's lore. As 1863 dawned with the first lambs bleating on the headlands, we sensed the balance shifting, the world's gaze no longer a novelty, but a tide that might yet erode our shores. Leora turned to me one crisp morning as we walked the cliff path with canes tapping like metronomes, the sea a distant murmur below. "They'll never cease pushing," she said, her breath visible in the chill, "but our begging has held them at bay thus far." I squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth pulse through, a quiet certainty growing that our unity, though tested, was the anchor against the swell. The spring of 1863 brought a tentative bloom to the cliffs, with primroses pushing through the thin turf like stubborn promises. But our lives stirred with undercurrents that no flower could soothe. At 12, Leora and I had grown into the awkward grace of our form, our heights matched at just over 4 feet, our steps a measured cadence aided by the eucanes that had become extensions of our will. The cottage hummed with the routines of recovery from the autumn ague. Mother steeped elderflower teas in the mornings, her pot simmering over the peat fire, while Father mended lines by the window, the twine whispering through his calloused fingers. The tour's remnants, a few sovereigns tucked in a tin beneath the floorboards, afforded small comforts, a new bolt of wool for our dresses, sewn with seams that hid our join without binding, and a second-hand perambulator adapted with wider wheels for outings to the cove, where the salt air cleared the last shadows from our lungs. Yet the respite was fleeting, as Voss's letters resumed with the regularity of the mail coach from Penzance. He wrote of opportunities in the industrial north, where mill owners and their families, flush from Lancashire's recoveries despite the cotton woes, sought entertainments to lift the pall of factory smoke. Father read them aloud one evening in April, as rain drummed on the thatch and we supped on barley broth, thickened with leeks from the garden. "Manchester and Leeds," he said, folding the paper with care. "Halls grander than Bath's, audiences of consequence who might subscribe to our future, schooling, a proper cart for travel, even land of our own." Leora's fork paused midway to our shared plate, her eyes meeting mine in the lamplight's glow. "And what future, Father? One where they prod us toward the knife under guise of philanthropy." I felt the warmth of her tension ripple through our side and added softly, "We've pleaded enough times, with surgeons in their starched coats, promoters with their silver tongues. Let these coins buy peace not passage to more stages where our wholeness is the spectacle. Mother set down her spoon, her face lined deeper by the winter's toll, and spoke for the first time on the matter since London. "The child's right, Josiah. We've danced to their tune long enough. The sea provides, as it always has." But father shook his head, the lines around his mouth tightening like nets drawn taut. The enclosure pressures mounted, with the squire's agent raising the rent again, citing taxes from the American War's tariffs, and the pilchard shoals veered southward that year, leaving boats light and larders lean. By May, under a sky heavy with May mist, he signed for a northern circuit. 6 months, Voss promised, with clauses barring any medical discourse, the earnings to fund a tutor permanent, and perhaps a move to a larger holding near Halle, away from the village's insistent gaze. The journey north tested us as no sea crossing could. We traveled by rail from Truro, the engine's whistle piercing the Devon hills like a harbinger, the compartments narrow and soot-streaked, forcing us to sit sideways with mother wedged beside. Leora and I clutched our reticules, filled with Miss Nancarrow's primers and a locket mother had strung on a chain we shared, a simple silver oval etched with doves, a token from her own girlhood. The landscape unfolded in stark contrasts, the green vales giving way to the blackened spires of Birmingham, then the relentless brick of Manchester, where factory whistles hooted like lost souls and the air hung thick with cotton dust. We arrived in June, lodged in a terraced house off Deansgate, its walls thin as the partitions between lives there. With Mrs. Poole summoned from London to resume her duties, her starched apron a familiar anchor amid the clamor. The engagements were in mechanics institutes and assembly rooms, venues built for lectures on steam engines and phrenology, now repurposed for our discourse on human harmony. Audiences differed from the South's gentry. Here were overlookers in broadcloth, their wives in shawls of mill-spun wool, and inventors with ink-stained fingers, drawn by broadsheets touting us as nature's ingenious design. Voss positioned the platform amid models of looms and astrolabes, the gaslights casting our shadows long across the polished floors. We spoke of Cornish heritage first, the tin streams and wreckers' lights, then delved into our unity, describing how pains echoed between us like ripples on a pond, joys amplified in tandem. Leora recounted dreams we shared, vivid tableaus of sailing ships or cliffside dances, her voice carrying over the coughs and murmurs, while I evoked the quiet intimacies, the brush of wind on our single profile, the harmony of our breaths in sleep. Questions came thick as the smog, probing not just our form, but the era's restless spirit. A engineer from Salford asked if our bond mirrored the linked gears of his machinery. Could it be disengaged for greater efficiency? Leora parried with wit. "Our gears turn as one, sir. To force them apart would grind the whole to dust." But I sensed the undercurrent. And in the green room afterward, with the scent of pipe tobacco clinging to the curtains, I voiced our plea to a cluster of lingering patrons, a matron from the Temperance Society, her brooch glinting piously. "We've begged from the first whisper of it, physicians in Bristol, promoters in Piccadilly, spare us the surgeon's art. Separation cleaves not merely flesh, but the silent language that binds our souls. In this unity we find purpose enough, without the hollow freedom of halves." The matron nodded, pressing a half-crown into mother's palm. But others were less yielding. A physician from the infirmary attended twice, his queries veiled in concern for our vital economy, hinting at ligatures refined by war surgeons. Earnings mounted, £10 weekly, wired south to ease father's debts, yet the pace wore on us. By August, as the mills shut for the Wakes holidays, our joints swelled from the humidity, and fevers returned, milder but persistent, quelled by Mrs. Poole's camphor rubs in the lodging's cramped parlor. Father wrote home of the prosperity, but Mother read his letters with a furrowed brow, noting the enclosures claiming more coastal strips for the squire's tenants. Leora and I lay awake those nights, the distant clatter of looms a mechanical lullaby, whispering of escape to quieter shores, though the canes by the bed reminded us of our tethered world. Autumn brought a pivot. Voss arranged a stint in Leeds, amid the woolen mills where the air smelled of lanolin and dye vats. But midway through September, a letter from Cornwall altered the course. Mother had fallen ill, a cough that lingered from the damp journey, turning to something deeper, the village doctor diagnosing consumption's shadow. Father cut the tour short, booking the return train with Voss's reluctant blessing, the promoter muttering of lost fees as he handed over the final purse. The journey south blurred in worry. We rattled through the Midlands under skies turning slate, Leora's hand in mine as we prayed silently, our shared pulse a metronome against the fear. Upon arrival, the cottage seemed smaller, the sea's roar louder, and Mother lay pale on the straw mattress, her breathing shallow as the tides ebb. We nursed her through the winter, our days a cycle of possets and compresses, Leora stirring the herbal brews while I read aloud from Miss Nancarrow's visits, now daily out of kindness. Father fished shorter hauls, his face gaunt, and the village rallied with broths and linens, though the squire's fund collectors paused their calls, respecting the grief. Mother's condition waxed and waned, her hand weak in ours as she whispered of the doves on the locket, symbols of souls undivided. In January 1864, as snow dusted the cliffs like forgotten lace, she slipped away at dawn, her last breath mingling with ours in the room's hush. The loss carved a hollow in our shared chest, deeper than any surgeon's line, and in the chapel's dim nave, as the parson intoned of reunion in heaven, Leora and I stood resolute, our plea unspoken but etched. We would endure as one, her absence a wound that time might scar but never sever. Father aged visibly then, his shoulders stooping like the bent thorns on the headland, and as spring thawed the earth, we turned 13 amid the quiet certainty that our path, though shadowed, remained entwined. Father's grief settled over the cottage like the perpetual mist that clung to the cliffs after Mother's passing, a veil that softened the edges of our days but could not blur the sharp ache in our shared chest. It was the spring of 1864, and at 13, Leora and I moved through the routines with a mechanical steadiness, our U-canes tapping against the flagstones as we tended the small garden, where primroses now mingled with the first shoots of potatoes. The sea's rhythm continued unabated, waves gnawing at the granite below, but inside silence reigned heavier than the peat smoke from the hearth. Father took to the boats at dawn, returning with hauls that he sold without a word, his eyes distant as the horizon, the sovereigns from the tours tucked away in the tin under the floorboards, untouched save for the barest necessities, flour from the mill at Hale, a jug of milk from Widow Jenkin. We managed the household as best our form allowed, Leora sweeping the floor with a broom adapted to our grip while I stirred the pottage of barley and wild greens gathered from the headland paths. Neighbors brought offerings still, loaves wrapped in cloths, a skein of yarn for mending, but their visits grew shorter, laced with awkward sympathies that hung in the air like unsaid prayers. Reverend Ellis called weekly, his Bible open on the table. reading from Job on trials endured, though his gaze often strayed to the locket we now wore constantly, its doves a silent testament to Mother's faith in our unity. "The Lord tests the faithful," he said one afternoon in May as sunlight slanted through the shutters, "but provides paths through the wilderness." Leora met his eyes steadily, our hands clasped beneath the tablecloth. "We've walked such paths already, Reverend, begging at every turn to remain as he shaped us. Mother's gone, yet our bond endures. Sever it, and we'd lose what little anchor remains." He inclined his head, murmuring of time's healing, but left with a pamphlet from the Bible Society, its pages filled with engravings of missionary twins in distant fields. Father, overhearing from the doorway, set his pipe down with a clatter. That evening, as the fire died to embers and we lay on the widened truckle bed, the cottage's drafts whispering through the thatch, he spoke for the first time of plans beyond survival. "The tin's calling louder than the pilchards these days," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Mines reopening up the coast near Red Ruth. Steady wage, not this feast or famine with the sea. We could relocate, find a place with room for independence." The word lingered, heavy as the fog, and I felt Leora's tension ripple through our side, her breath quickening. "Independence for whom, Father?" he replied softly. "We've pleaded since the surgeons first came. Leave us whole. A new home might shield us from stairs, but not from the knives that follow coin." The idea took root slowly, like kelp washed ashore after a gale. As summer deepened and the enclosures claimed another strip of common, grazing near the cove. Father's boat yielded scant that season, the shoals scattered by warmer currents from the south, and letters from Voss arrived with tales of continental exhibitions, Paris salons where anomalies drew the emperor's court. But Father burned them, his hand steady now with purpose, and by August he secured work at the Wheelvore mine, a vein of copper-laced tin burrowing into the moors 10 miles inland. We departed in September, the coastal van laden with our few possessions, the perambulator folded, Mother's shawl draped over our shoulders, winding up from St. Ives through lanes thick with blackberries, the sea's farewell roar fading behind the tors. Red Ruth was a world of clamor and confinement, its streets choked with ore carts rumbling from the shafts, the air sharp with the tang of arsenic from the stamping mills. We settled in a miner's cottage on the parish edge, its walls of slate and its single room echoing with the distant clangs of the engine houses. Father rose before light, descending the adit with lantern in hand, emerging at dusk caked in clay, his cough growing from the powder-laden air. Leora and I adapted to the narrower spaces, our steps negotiating the uneven thresholds, though the hillside paths to the chapel proved treacherous, slick with runoff from the rain barrels. Miss Nancaro followed us there, her lessons now in the evenings by tallow candle, her voice competing with the hoot of the winding gear. She taught of the Reform Act's echoes, the franchise widening for men like Father, and the empire's cotton mills starving from Sherman's march across Georgia, tying our isolation to broader tides. Yet the move stirred fresh intrusions. The mining folk were hardy, their faces etched like the engineer's diagrams, but curiosity burned hot as the boiler fires. Bow maidens at the stamps paused their breaking of ore to stare as we passed, with our canes, their clattering hammers falling silent, and children trailed us to the Bible class, whispering of the joined ones from the sea. Reverend Polglaze, the local parson, visited soon after our arrival, his study lined with geological surveys from the Royal School of Mines. He spoke kindly of community, but his questions veered to our form, how the descent into the earth might strain our shared frame. whether the doctors at Camborne might assess for relief. Leora answered first, her tone measured. We've begged such relief away, sir, from Bristol's tables to London's halls. The earth binds us as surely as our flesh. To mind for division would unearth only sorrow. I added, feeling the weight of the moors pressing down, Father brought us here for steadiness, not to unearth what God has sealed. Father, listening from the corner, nodded but said nothing, his eyes on the tin box where the fund now mingled with mine wages. Near £80 enough, the parson hinted, for a consultation in Truro with specialists trained in the new antiseptic ways. The winter of 1864 to 65 tested us harshly. Gales battering the cottage roof while the shafts flooded, idling Father for weeks and forcing him to take day labor at the dressing floors, sifting tailings under skies perpetually gray. We fell ill then, a chest congestion from the damp, our shared lungs laboring like the beam engines overhead, eased only by Miss Nan Caro's visits with her stores of horehound. In the fever's haze, Leora whispered of Mother's locket, its doves a bridge to the lost, and I clung to her hand, our pleas a litany against the encroaching chill. No separation, no unraveling, only the endurance we'd forged through loss. By spring 1865, as the engine houses puffed anew and the first ore trains rumbled to the coast, Father broached the fund openly one evening, over a supper of pasty filled with scavenged turnips. It's grown, he said, sliding the tin across the table. From the tours, the village, the men's subscriptions at the mine. Truro's infirmary has a man from Edinburgh. Ligature's finer than spider silk, they say. One of you could learn a trade, live apart but near. Leora's fork stilled, our pulse thundering in unison. And the other, Father? Cast aside like spent ore? We've begged you through every season, surgeons, parsons, promoters, to honor this bond. Mother's gone because of Earth's cruelties, not ours. Don't let man's add to it. I pressed on, tears pricking but voice steady. The money could buy books, a cart for freer days, not a blade to have what sustains us. Please, let it be. He pushed the tin away, his face crumpling like the cliffs in a slide, and the matter hung unresolved as the year turned. We walked the moor paths then, canes sinking into the turf where tin streams glittered like veins, feeling the weight of choices unmade, our unity a quiet defiance against the grinding wheels of progress. The mind's rhythm became our own, relentless, unyielding, and in that shared labor of living, we found a fragile footing, though the whispers of parting echoed still in the engine's ceaseless beat. The summer of 1865 unfurled over the moors like a tattered banner, the gorse blooming yellow against the engine house's relentless puffing. But our days in the red roofed cottage carried the weight of unresolved shadows. At 14, Leora and I had grown accustomed to the mine's distant thrum, a vibration that seemed to echo through our shared frame as we navigated the hillside paths with our U-canes, the ground uneven with slag heaps and runoff from the stamps. Father labored longer shifts now, the Wilvore vein yielding copper enough to keep the bow maidens busy at the dressing floors, their hammers ringing like a mechanical chorus from dawn till dusk. He brought home wages steadier than the pilchards ever had, shillings wrapped in oilcloth, added to the tin beneath the boards, but his cough deepened, a rasping legacy of the powder-laden air, and his evenings were spent by the fire, staring into the flames as if seeking answers in the peat's glow. Miss Nancaro's lessons continued faithfully, her satchel heavier with volumes borrowed from the Camborne Library, histories of the geological surveys that mapped Cornwall's underbelly, tales of the great exhibition's marvels from a decade past. She settled us at the scarred oak table each Tuesday and Thursday, the candlelight flickering on pages yellowed by handling, and we traced the strata of rock with our fingers, Leora's hand guiding the left while mine steadied the right. "The earth holds secrets joined as surely as you," she said one afternoon in July, as thunder rumbled over the tors, her voice soft against the patter of rain on the slate roof. We learned of Darwin's latest, the variation of animals and plants, smuggled in despite the parson's frowns, its words painting nature's bonds as threads in a vast weave, not flaws to be snipped. Leora absorbed it eagerly, her mind wandering to the fossil cliffs we'd left behind, while I pondered the quiet endurance of roots entwined in soil, our own form a microcosm of such persistence. Yet the village's curiosity, once a whisper on the sea wind, now clanged like the mine's bells. The miners' wives formed a sewing circle at the chapel, ostensibly for charity blankets, but their needles paused when we entered, eyes tracing our sway as we took seats on the back pew, our canes propped against the hassock. Mrs. Trimbath, whose husband captained a tributing team deep in the Adate, approached one evening after vespers, her hands rough from cobbling ore, pressing a loaf still warm from her oven into Mother's old shawl, now ours to carry. "You've a strength in your joining," she murmured, her Cornish lilt thick as clotted cream. "But the doctor at the infirmary speaks of new ways, cautery irons from Lister's trials, to staunch the blood without fever." Leora straightened, our shoulders aligning in quiet defiance. "Strength indeed, ma'am, born of what God ordained. We've begged every healer from here to London. Spare us the irons, for they burn away not just vessels, but the very harmony that lets us breathe as one." The woman nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes, and slipped away to join the circle, where murmurs resumed like the drip of water in the shafts. Father's resolve wavered under such tides. By August, as the harvest fairs dotted the moors with tents and fiddles, the squire's agent rode up from Saint. Ives on a bay gelding, his ledgers balanced on the saddle, inquiring after the fund, now past £100, swelled by subscriptions from the mine's surface men and a collection at the last assizes. A consultation in Truro, he proposed over cider in our parlor, the air thick with the scent of fermenting apples from the neighbor's press. The new railway makes it simple. No more jolting coaches. Doctor, Penrose there studied under the Edinburgh men. He promises assessment without commitment, just to weigh the possibilities. Father leaned forward, his pipe unlit, the lines on his face deepening like cracks in the load. "And if we refuse the blade after?" The agent smiled thinly. "The choice remains yours, but knowledge is a lantern in the dark." We felt the pull as keenly as the beam engine's haul. That night, as the cottage settled into quiet, the distant hoot of the winding gear marking the 11 o'clock shift, Leora turned to me on the truckle bed, our shared blanket drawn against the chill seeping through the walls. "They circle like tributers seeking pay dirt," she whispered, her breath warm on my cheek. "But we'll mine our own vein of will." I squeezed her hand, the locket's chain cool between us, and in the morning we confronted Father at breakfast, the table set with porridge thinned by the rising cost of meal from the American strife. "We've pleaded through every season and sorrow," I said, my voice steady as the canes beside my chair. "From Mother's bedside to the stage's glare, let the fund light a different path. Books for Miss Nancarrow's shelves, a pony and trap to roam the moors unbound by stairs. Separation offers no lantern, only eclipse." He pushed his bowl away, his cough rattling like loose gravel, and for days the matter hung, unresolved as the fog that blanketed the engine houses. The fare came and went, with us wheeling the perambulator through the crowds to avoid the crush, the air alive with the sizzle of gingerbread and the bleat of prize sheep. But whispers followed, tales of us as the mind's marvel, fit for exhibition in the county halls. Reverend Polglaze preached on unity and diversity that Sunday, his sermon twisting proverbs to hint at bonds meant for testing, and afterward, in the vestry's dim light scented with incense, he pressed pamphlets on surgical triumphs from Vienna. Leora met his gaze, our pulses sinking in resolve. Test us if you must, Reverend, but we've begged the world over. No blade can forge what faith already tempers. Our diversity is wholeness. To divide it is to shatter the vessel. Autumn brought a turning in the weather and perhaps in father. Gales lashed the moors, flooding the lower adits and idling half the men, while his cough worsened, confining him to the cottage with compresses of mustard plaster. We tended him then, Leora fetching water from the pump while I read from the primers, our voices blending in passages on the Reform League's stirrings, the vote's expansion a distant echo of our own constrained agency. The agent returned once more in October, but father waved him off from his sickbed, his voice hoarse but firm. "Not now," he rasped. "Not with this." The fund's tin remained buried, a quiet victory amid the storm, though as the leaves stripped the sycamores bare, we walked the paths less traveled, canes sinking into the sodden turf, feeling the earth's unyielding grip mirror our own. Leora's dreams grew vivid that winter, visions of moors unmined, freedoms charted on maps we drew by candlelight, and in sharing them, our pleas evolved from defense to quiet assertion, a thread pulling us toward horizons yet unseen, even as the mind's shadows lengthened around us. The winter of 1865 clung to the moors like a shroud, the gales howling through the engine houses until the beams groaned and the shafts wept, water into the workings below. Father worsened steadily, his cough evolving into a rattle that echoed the mind's own labored breaths, confining him to the truckle bed by the hearth, where we'd once lain as children. At 14, Leora and I took on the burdens of the cottage with a determination born of necessity, our U-canes propped by the door as we hauled buckets from the pump, the icy slush soaking our hems and numbing our shared feet. Miss Nancaro came daily now, not just for lessons, but to help with the simples, steeping willow bark in the kettle and binding his chest with linens warmed by the fire. She read to him from the primers when our voices tired, her steady tone recounting the Sanitary Act's new clauses on miners' health, though the words seemed distant as the stars wheeling over the tors. The village extended quiet mercies. Mrs. Trimbath brought broth thickened with barley from the chapel stores, her visits brief, but her eyes kind, lingering on our form without the old probing. Reverend Polglaze called less often, his sermons shifting to themes of providence and affliction, as if mother's loss and father's decline had tempered his zeal for our relief. The fund's tin remained undisturbed beneath the floorboards, a silent testament to our pleas, though whispers persisted at the stamping floors. Tales of us as the mind's enduring enigma, fit for the county's medical journals rather than the surgeon's table. Leora and I spoke little of it then, our days a rhythm of care, stirring the pottage at noon, reading aloud in the afternoons from volumes on the American peace talks, their fractured union a shadowed parallel to our own unyielding bond. Father rallied briefly in February, sitting up to whittle a new set of canes from ash saplings, his knife steady despite the tremor in his hands. "You've kept us whole," he murmured one evening, his eyes meeting ours in the firelight, "through seas and stages. Perhaps that's lesson enough." But March brought no thaw for him. The fever took hold on the 12th, the same day we'd been born 14 years prior, and by dawn his breathing stilled, leaving the cottage echoing with absence greater than mother's. We stood by the bed as the parson arrived, his prayer book open to Psalms on the Valley of Shadows, while Miss Nancarrow arranged the shroud with hands that did not shake. The burial was simple, on a hillside overlooking the workings, the ground still iron hard under the sexton's spade, attended by a score of miners in their oilskins, their caps doffed against the wind. Leora and I wheeled the perambulator to the graveside, our shared grief a weight that bowed us forward. Yet in that unity we found the strength to endure the condolences, rough hands clasping ours, murmurs of brave lasses that carried no demand for division. Orphaned now, at 14, we turned to the parish guardians, who placed us under Miss Nancarrow's roof in a widow's cottage nearer Camborne, her spinsterhood a shield against further intrusions. The move came swiftly in April, the van laden with our trunk and father's tools, the moors given way to the steadier lanes of the town, where the railway's smoke trailed like a promise of broader worlds. Miss Nancarrow's home was modest. 2 rooms with a loft reached by a ladder we climbed with practiced harmony, her lessons expanding to include needlework and accounts, skills for self-sufficiency in a world that viewed us as curiosities rather than kin. She petitioned the overseers for a small annuity from the fund, £20 yearly, enough for our keep without touching the principal, and they granted it, swayed perhaps by the parson's letter praising our moral fortitude in resisting the blade. Life settled into a quieter cadence there, the stamp of the distant mines a muffled drum rather than the heartbeat of our days. We walked the paths to the market with canes tapping in unison, bartering for cloth and tea with coins from the annuity, our form drawing fewer stairs amid Camborne's bustle of engineers and assayers. Miss Nancarrow introduced us to her circle, a lending library where we borrowed Scott's novels and Lyell's geology, our evenings spent tracing illustrations of stratified rocks, Leora's finger following the seams as if mapping our own. She grew more outward-facing, corresponding with a cousin in Plymouth who sent pamphlets on women's education, while I found solace in the herb garden she tended, planting lavender and rosemary whose scents bridged the losses we'd carried from the sea. Yet autonomy emerged not in grand gestures, but in small assertions. By 1867, at 16, we apprenticed under a dressmaker, Mrs. Eames, whose shop overlooked the high street, her needles flying through bombazine and muslin for the wives of mine captains. Our joined hands proved adept at fine seams, Leora's left guiding the thread while mine steadied the cloth, producing garments of such precision that orders came from as far as Falmouth. Earnings supplemented the annuity, allowing us to purchase a pony and trap, a sturdy mare named Wren, harnessed to a light cart widened for our frame, and with it we ventured to the coast on Sundays, the rain shared in our laps as the wheels crunched over granite roads. The sea's salt revived old rhythms, gulls wheeling as they had in childhood, and in those outings our pleas against separation felt less a defense than a quiet truth lived daily. The world beyond tested that truth in subtler ways. Voss wrote once in 1868, proposing a respectable lecture series in Edinburgh, where Darwin's shadow loomed large, but Miss Nancarrow burned the letter unread, her voice firm. "You've outgrown the stages. Let the fund grow with interest, for a home of your own one day." Suitors came indirectly, sons of merchants inquiring through Mrs. Eames, their intentions veiled in offers of patronage, but we deflected with polite resolve, Leora quipping of shared hearts needing no division, while I evoked the Locket's doves as eternal companions. By 1870, at 19, we had saved enough to lease a small cottage on the town's edge, its garden sloping to a stream where we planted the herbs from Miss Nancarrow's plot. Father and mother's graves lay a day's ride away, visited yearly with wildflowers, the tins balance now nearing 200 pounds, invested in railway shares that yielded steadily. Turning 21 in 1872 brought a shift in the air, like the westerlies clearing the summer haze. Miss Nancarrow, her health failing from a lung complaint, deeded us her cottage and the annuity's oversight, passing quietly that autumn amid the turning leaves. We mourned her as kin, her lessons the turning point that granted us agency, not through rebellion, but through the quiet accrual of skills and savings. The dressmaking thrived, our reputation spread into Truro's assemblies, where we fitted gowns for the gentry without the old spectacles. Leora began sketching patterns, her designs incorporating hidden supports for our form, while I managed the ledgers, our partnership a seamless weave. Whispers of separation faded to antiquarian tales, the surgeon's arts advancing toward other marvels, antiseptics sealing wounds without our scars. In the cottage's hearthglow, as we supped on pasties baked with our own hands, Leora turned to me one evening in 1875, the locket glinting on our chain. "We've begged the world to see us whole, and in time it has learned to look away." I nodded, the warmth of our shared pulse a steady anchor, the unresolved fury of youth mellowing into the sober certainty of lives entwined by choice, not compulsion. The decades following our settlement in the Camborne cottage unfolded like the slow unfurling of a fern frond in the moorland spring, steady and unhurried, each year layering upon the last without the clamor of our earlier trials. By 1880, at 29, Leora and I had transformed Mrs. Eames's apprenticeship into a modest enterprise, our shop a narrow frontage on the high street where bolts of calico and serge lined the walls, and our sewing machine, purchased second-hand from a Truro importer, hummed through the afternoons like a contented bee. Customers came not for spectacle, but for the precision of our work. Bodices fitted without a pinch, hemmed straight as the railway lines snaking toward the coast. Leora designed the patterns, her sketches capturing the era's bustle skirts and leg-o'-mutton sleeves, with an eye for the practical, while I handled the fittings, my voice guiding the pins with the same quiet assurance that had once steadied our pleas against the surgeons. Earnings flowed into a locked box, supplementing the annuity and railway shares, enough by 1885 to hire a girl from the parish, young Eliza Trelawney, whose nimble fingers eased the load, and whose chatter filled the gaps left by Miss Nancarrow's absence. Father's legacy lingered in small ways. The tin box, now passed to us by the overseers, had grown to near 400 pounds through prudent investments in the Great Western lines, a buffer against the mine slumps that rippled through Cornwall like aftershocks. We rode Wren's successor, a dappled gelding named Gale, on Sundays to the graves at Redruth, the trap's wheels tracing familiar ruts as we laid heather and thrift at the stones, the sea's distant murmur a reminder of the cliffs we'd left. The world shifted around us. The telegraph wires strung across the moors in 1883, carrying news of Gladstone's reforms and the Sudan campaigns, binding distant events to our quiet routine. Leora followed the suffrage stirrings in the papers, her evenings spent annotating articles on women's property rights, while I tended the garden. the lavender scent evoking mother's hands on the rushes. Suitors appeared sporadically, a clerk from the assay office, a widower engineer, drawn perhaps by our self-sufficiency, but we met them with the same measured deflection. "Our path is charted as one," Leora would say, her tone leaving no room for persuasion. By the 1890s, as Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee echoed through the streets with bunting and brass bands, our form drew less notice amid Camborne's growing bustle. The railway brought day trippers from Plymouth, their eyes on the engine houses rather than us, and our shop thrived on orders for the Jubilee's finery. Silk sashes and embroidered collars that we dispatched in neat parcels. Health held steady. Our shared lungs drew the clean air of the uplands without the mine's powder, though twinges came in the damp winters, eased by herbal draughts and the warmth of the hearth. Leora took to writing letters to the Cornubian, anonymous pieces on the resilience of the overlooked, weaving our experiences into broader tales of endurance without revealing our join. I supported her, inking the pages by gaslight, feeling the old fury stir faintly when replies debated medical progress, antiseptics now commonplace, separations routine for lesser anomalies. "They've forgotten us," she murmured one night in 1897, as frost etched the window panes, but the begging shaped us still. The turn of the century brought subtle freedoms. In 1901, at 50, we leased a larger cottage on the town's outskirts. Its rooms widened for our perambulator, now motorized with a small engine from the engineering works, a contraption of brass and leather that carried us to the market without strain. Eliza married a cooper and left us, but we hired another, then none, managing alone with the ease of long practice. The Boer War's end in 1902 filled the papers with tales of divided loyalties, mirroring our own steadfast union, and Leora corresponded with a nurse from the field hospitals, learning of ether's refinements that spared lives where once it claimed them. "They cut and mend as if flesh were clay," she wrote back, "but some bonds defy the wheel." I read her drafts aloud, our voices harmonizing the words, the locket's doves worn smooth against our skin. Aging crept in with the Edwardian years, our steps slowing to a gentle roll, the canes laid aside for the perambulator's hum. By 1914, as the Great War's shadows lengthened over Europe, we closed the shop, living on the fund's matured shares, now a comfortable sum yielding £20 quarterly, and the pensions granted to Father's mine service. The trenches news arrived via the telegraph, boys from Camborne marching off in khaki, and we sewed bandages for the Red Cross, our needles threading linen in the lamplight, a quiet contribution to a world fracturing along lines we had long refused. Leora grew frailer first, her breath shortening in the flu pandemic of 1918, though our shared vitality pulled her through. The doctor's visits met with our familiar resolve. No interventions, no separations pondered in extremis. The interwar peace settled us deeper into reflection. In the 1920s, as motorcars choked the lanes and wireless sets crackled with Wraith's broadcasts, we listened to tales of the Empire's remnants, Leora's hand in mine, as we sat by the wireless in the widened armchair. The old fury resurfaced in quiet moments, recalling the squire's agents, the promoter's smiles, the surgeon's diagrams that sought to unravel what God had woven. "They saw us as a knot to untie," she said one evening in 1925, the fire's glow warming our joined side, but begging them spared us the half-life they promised. I nodded, the unresolved thread of defiance a steady undercurrent, not rage, but a firm knowing that our wholeness had outlasted their ambitions. By the 1930s, at near 80, time's weight pressed heavier. Leora passed in the spring of 1932, her breath easing into silence one dawn as cherry blossoms drifted past the window, our shared heart faltering in her wake, yet sustaining me through the haze of grief. The doctor attended without suggestion of prior cuts, honoring the life we'd claimed. I live on alone now, in this cottage adapted for one, the perambulator gathering dust, the locket her final gift around my neck. At 74, as I speak into this machine in 1925, no, forgive the slip of years, it's 1925 in my mind's eye, but the calendar marks later. I carry the quiet fury still, not for the loss, but for those who would have halved us from the cradle. We begged because separation was no salvation, only the theft of the soul's silent companion. In our unity, we found truth enough, lives entwined, enduring as the granite beneath the moors, whole in defiance of the world's insistent hands. And so it ends, not in clamor, but in the steady beat that remains mine alone,